Hey everyone, this is Dr. Pollock. Welcome to this week's video lecture for PS 102. Today our main point of business is going to be discussing the bureaucracy. We'll get into that in a little bit. Before that though, I have just a couple announcements to make regarding the course, and then I want to talk a little bit about the QQC article you guys responded to for last week. First of all, as you can see on the screen here, we've got a quiz coming up this Friday. This will be on the bureaucracy, so the material you would have read for chapter 14 and the material which I will talk about today when we get into the lecture. I'll send out more details on this prior to the quiz. I'll send out more details. The way it's going to work is it will be online, and the way I'm going to set it up is that you'll be able to take the quiz anytime on Friday at your convenience. Otherwise, the content of the quiz will be pretty similar to previous quizzes we've had in this class. It will just be online. All the questions will be multiple choice, so it'll be 10 of them, and it'll all be about the bureaucracy. Okay, so look forward to that. And again, I'll send out a reminder and more details on the exact implementation of the quiz. It should be on Moodle for you guys. It should be pretty straightforward. Otherwise, here, the last thing, or the other thing I should say that I wanted to mention as far as announcements was that for next week, please read the chapter on the judiciary. This will be the next lecture that I'll be putting out here, and it'll be probably a topic that we have a quiz on next week, right? So you want to get started on this reading at some point. Otherwise, I'll get rid of this and we can get going with our discussion of the material for the day. Before I talk about the bureaucracy and the book chapter, I wanted to just refer back a little bit to this discussion, or this article, I should say, that you guys responded to in your QQC. So here, of course, the coronavirus remains the major, I should say, story in the news. In terms of politics in Washington, D.C. today, this is certainly today, meaning this current time period, it remains the number one issue. Here I assign you to read about this $2.2 trillion CARES Act, the coronavirus stimulus law. And so you guys responded in a number of different ways, which I wanted to talk about a little bit here. I won't go over the details of the article since you guys read this, but it's first of all, just going through all the provisions, or at least the major provisions of the bill, one of which involves these direct payments to many people, not all people, which we'll talk about here. Direct payments to people, this is in response to just the broad effects that this coronavirus outbreak is having on the population. Unemployment insurance, healthcare, so aid directly into the healthcare system, loans to small businesses. So this is something that when we get into our discussion of the bureaucracy, I'll use just as an example here of federal government implementation of new programs. So this is a program to help small businesses basically keep people on their payroll rather than have to fire them. So if you're a small business and you're having trouble with revenue and cash flow, you can apply for this loan, and it'll allow you to keep people working for you. This $500 billion for state governments and also for certain larger businesses. And here we're not talking about small businesses, we're talking about larger corporations who are being impacted by the coronavirus outbreak, many of which are. This is something to where, to the extent that there was controversy in this bill, it was maybe here, and I'll talk about that more in a second. And maybe this is something else we'll talk about, maybe not today, but going forward, just the oversight in this bill and what's been happening recently with that in terms of what Congress is doing and what the executive branch is responding with regarding the coronavirus response. But anyway, in terms of your QQCs, a few points that I thought were interesting that I'll go through. First of all, several of you noted that one interesting part about this legislation was that it was bipartisan in nature, right? So for the most part, we didn't see the type of partisan infighting that we see in most large controversial pieces of legislation, right? So this is definitely something noteworthy, and so I think this is a good observation for many of you, right? The way this worked in terms of its passage, and if you followed the actual way it unfolded in the news, in the Senate, there was sort of a minor delay in that there were parts of the law specifically pertaining to, or at least mostly pertaining to, this $500 billion which could potentially be loaned out to corporations. The Democrats are concerned with this, so there was some delay in terms of passage there. So the Democrats, even though they're a minority in the Senate, they have the power to filibuster bills, and so they sort of blocked the bill going forward for a day or two there. Eventually, there's more negotiation, and they're brought on board, and the bill passes 96 to nothing in the Senate. So, quite clearly unanimous, widespread consensus in the Senate that transcends party lines. Later on, a few days later on, the bill goes into the House, and again, for the most part, there wasn't any hiccup. There was one, but if you follow the actual passage of the bill, there was one hiccup in that Thomas Macy, a particular representative, threatened to delay the bill. One individual representative doesn't have the ability to stop a bill, but the way it worked in this case was that there was a voice vote in the House. So if there's something that has a large degree of consensus, you don't necessarily have to take a roll call vote in which everyone has their individual vote counted. You just have everyone that's there. The yays say yay, then the nays say nay, and then it's determined if there's a clear winner. You just go with the voice vote in certain circumstances, and that was what was used in the House in this case, just to avoid having to bring everyone back to the House when numerous government officials are actually contracting the virus. But anyway, the Thomas Macy situation was just that he was threatening to do some procedural maneuvers that would have required a roll call, a counted vote, rather than a voice vote. Eventually, though, the House gets beyond that, and they just have a voice vote, so there's no actually official count of the votes in the House. But again, it was quite clearly a broad bipartisan consensus in this case, so that's something that was noteworthy in terms of this bill. Another thing that you guys talked about in your QQCs with respect to the package was how its provisions are either impacting you guys personally or in many cases not going to impact you, right? So here, specifically in this section, the direct payments to Americans, this is something to where you have income caps up to $75,000, you get $1,200, and then for every child, every dependent, you're getting a $500 payment. So in this case, what many of you wrote about, I guess you had learned about the bill independently of beyond just what this article says. This bill is not covering dependents who are 18 years of age or older. So this is another related article that you weren't assigned to read, but one that I found online. It happened to be from the Technician, the NC State student newspaper, talking about the situation of this bill relative to many students. So if you are a student at NC State, presumably you're 18 years of age or older. If you are covered as a dependent on your parents' tax returns, which many of you were and are, as at least according to your QQCs, and I'm sure many of you who didn't write about it in your QQCs are, your parents will not be allowed to, at the current moment, as things stand, claim this $500 credit for you. So even though you're a dependent, your parents aren't getting the $500, and if the fact that you are listed as a dependent also is preventing you from getting the $1,200 per person. Okay, so it's sort of a gap in the legislation, which I don't know if it was intended to be this way, but it's emerged here that there's a substantial group of people, college students, who very often are listed as dependents for their parents' purposes, their parents' tax income purposes, and they're not receiving any benefits under this bill, any direct benefits, either through the $1,200 that they would get or through the $500 that their parents would get for dependents. And so we have this gap, which is affecting many of you. And so this was pretty understandably something that you guys wrote about as being concerned with this legislation. To that note, again, if you wanted to find this, you could look up the article title. It's in the Intercept. This article here is talking about, and this is news that I've read elsewhere also, that there's this new, I don't know if it's gotten too far yet, but a new bill being considered that would be passed to sort of close this gap and make college-age dependents eligible for the $500 credit, their parents eligible for this $500 credit, which would help relieve some of the financial burden that's falling presumably on both the parents and the college student in this case. And in general, this is something that we'll keep an eye on, this specific provision, but more generally, there's potentially future stimulus packages already being discussed. I don't know that they're uh, that far into the legislative lawmaking process yet, but it certainly seems like at some point in the not too distant future, we will have an additional stimulus bill being considered in Congress and potentially passed. Okay, that's a big possibility, and this is something that, at least for many senators, is seems like it's coming to mind as in terms of fixes for the previous stimulus. So this is something to where if you're affected by this, you'll probably be paying attention, and maybe you'll get some relief in this form going forward. So that was another good comment in the QQCs, just the way that the bill is affecting you, or in some cases neglecting you guys. Uh, Finally, another pretty common comment here, or question sometimes, depending on the way you framed it, coming from this article, which is somewhere up here. I don't know where I'll go in. Give me a second. Apologies for closing this out, but what I was getting at is many of you wrote here about the bill with respect to its price tag in your QQCs, right? So here, $2.2 trillion. Many of you correctly noted in your QQCs that the United States is already more than $20 trillion in debt. And so many of you observed or asked, where is this money coming from? Where are we getting $2.2 trillion from? Whenever we want to spend a lot of money, it's usually a big debate. We talked about the appropriations process in Congress and how it's usually very contentious and it's very difficult to get Democrats and Republicans on board with anything that we want to spend money on, anything that's contentious. So a lot of you just asked about the price tag. Where's this money coming from? How is it that $2.2 trillion is being appropriated here so easily in this emergency stimulus bill? And so this is a good opportunity, I guess, just to briefly talk about where money comes from in the federal government. So you guys are correct. Those who mentioned that we're already in a lot of debt. And so how can we get more money at this point in time? That's a correct observation. We do have in terms of dollar amount, a pretty large national debt at this point. The thing of it is that the United States borrowing capacity is still just, notwithstanding the amount of debt we have, our borrowing capacity still remains very strong, right? And so if you wanted to analogize this to your own personal finances, if you're somebody who's gotten into, I don't know, applying for credit cards or loans, probably not student loans in this case, but other loans, or for whatever reason, you've just been, you're trying to develop your credit, you have your own personal credit score and credit history, and that to lending institutions is sort of setting the bounds as far as how much money they would be willing to lend to you. Okay, so everyone based on their credit score, there's going to be an upper limit on the amount of money that they could take out as debt from lending institutions. For a country, it's not that simple, but it's sort of analogous, like I said, right? The United States, when we borrow money, historically speaking, we've always paid it back, right? That's the important part here. Money is very, very secure when it's being lent, when you're lending it to the national government. And so the United States borrowing capacity remains very strong. I think I've heard the comment from the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, that they're estimating that we could get as much as $6 trillion in immediate money borrowed if we needed to. So the short of it here, as far as why we're able to still borrow $2.2 trillion, even though we're already in debt a considerable amount, it's just that our borrowing capacity remains very strong. I have up here just to give a little bit more context to this. The way this works, when the United States needs to borrow money, they issue bonds. Okay, so here, this is actually the chart I'm bringing up on CNBC. This is the interest rate for the United States 10-year Treasury bond. So here, if you're somebody who has an amount of money that you want to invest, a very safe way to invest that money which will give you a fixed return. A certain return is to buy a United States Treasury bond, in this case, the 10-year bond, and the interest rate, you'll note, is very low, 0.7, just under 0.75%. So the United States basically is able to borrow money at a very low interest rate. It issues these 10-year Treasury bonds. People, or maybe more so financial institutions, will buy them as a safe investment vehicle, and the United States is paying only 0.75% interest on these bonds. Okay, and that's just because, as I mentioned, the United States Treasury bond is a very safe investment, and especially in this sort of time where we have a large degree of financial uncertainty, people are very willing to put their money in Treasury bonds. So here you see the decline here, the interest rate. When it's higher, that's indicating that the federal government has to pay a higher interest rate. You see the sharp decline right around the time the coronavirus outbreak really begins to happen. It's a result of market uncertainty, people wanting a safe investment instrument, and so they're more willing to buy these treasury bonds, and so the amount of interest goes down that the federal government has to pay because the bonds are in more demand. And so the short of it, getting back to your question on the QQC, is the reason we're able to take $2.2 trillion more or less instantaneously is just that the United States borrowing capacity is very strong. Really, in terms of the options you have as a major investor, it's the safest, it's it's a guaranteed investment to where it's not going to be a huge payoff for you. So there are potentially riskier investments you can make that might, if they go well, have a greater return for you. But in terms of safe, guaranteed returns, this is really the gold standard, the United States Treasury bonds. And so that's why the American government has such a great capacity to borrow. But one other related question here, I guess I did have this tab still open, but anyway, one other question related to the financial side of this bill that you guys asked. A few of you asked whether people are required to pay back the money that they're receiving. And so that's something I guess worth mentioning here briefly. So in terms of the direct payments, so if you're somebody who receives $1,200, or eventually if some of you get the $500 payment through your parents, this money is not required to be paid back, right? So it's not as though you're getting $1,200 this year and then next year you have to pay it back in your 2020 taxes or 2021 down the line, whatever. I mean, this is a grant in this case. For the individual distribution of money, this is a grant, and there's no expectation that it's ever going to be paid back. In terms of some of these other provisions, though, it's a little bit different, right? So, for instance, we'll talk about these small business loans a little bit more just as an example of what the bureaucracy does. In this case, they're technically loans, but most of them are expected to be forgiven, that are given to these small businesses with 500 employees or less or fewer. So in this case, it's in effect a grant, so not really expected to be paid back for most of the money here either. What we do get into, though, as far as this, the loans to the larger corporations, larger industries, and some state governments, this $500 billion. Here we're getting into a situation in which, by and large, the expectation is that these loans will be paid back. And so you can go back to other bailouts we've had in prior financial or economic crises, is a better way to put it. And the government lends out money to large corporations or sometimes large banks. The expectation is that that money is not given as a grant in most cases, but paid back. It varies, though, the extent to which the people or the corporations receiving the money actually are able to pay it back. So that's a question here. So in this case, much of this $500 billion that presumably will be lent out will be paid back, but it's really depending on whether or not these industries actually survive and are able to pay back the loans that they're going to be getting. But for your purposes, if you're somebody who's in this situation of receiving a direct deposit into your account or a check, you're not going to be required to pay that back. Okay, so that's what I wanted to discuss here as far as this article goes. Probably here over the next few days, I'll assign another QQC depending on other things going on in the world of politics. There's a lot. There's, like I mentioned, A new stimulus bill being considered. I don't know if it's too far along the line though of towards passage. There's still a primary season going on technically. We had a vote in Wisconsin yesterday, which was somewhat controversial as far as whether or not it should have actually happened. But there are still things going on, and so the short of it, I'll probably assign you some articles here from time to time going forward. Okay, so let's get into our discussion here of the bureaucracy, and this will be what we spend the rest of the time here talking about. So to set things up, let me just give you a definition. I think that's a good place to start, and then just spend a little bit of time orienting the bureaucracy relative to other branches of government here. So the overall outline of this discussion, I want to spend some time talking about sort of the general role, and again, the general orientation of the bureaucracy relative to other branches of government. We'll spend some time talking about the specific role, the specific functions that the bureaucracy plays, the things that it does. Then I want to spend toward the end of the lecture here a little bit of time talking about the historical progression of the bureaucratic system. It's something that changes in a couple of different noteworthy ways throughout the history of the country. Okay, so to start out with, let me just give you the definition. If you've done the reading on the bureaucracy, you probably have a pretty good idea already of what we're talking about with this term. These would be, first of all, this is an important start, the executive branch. This is what we're talking about. We're in the executive branch at this point in time. Executive branch, departments and agencies. And that are responsible for implementing laws. All right, and so again, just to orient this relative to other branches of government we've mentioned before. Okay, so we have our three branches: Congress, the executive branch, the judicial branch. And we talked about Congress extensively already. Congress, the short of it is just that they're responsible for passing laws. Okay, so that's what they do, mostly what they do. We haven't talked about the judicial branch in detail yet, but we've talked about them in broad terms. This is a branch of government that's responsible for criminal prosecutions, that's responsible for, when needed, interpreting laws, interpreting provisions of the Constitution. We're not gonna really get too much into the judicial branch right now, but that's forthcoming. The executive branch, so far we've talked about the president and the things that the president does. We talked about how the overarching role of this branch, though, is, as the term is implying, to execute laws. Okay, so this is something, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the semester, we talked about how our Articles of Confederation government lacked executive power, it lacked an executive office. And the President of the United States is the person who is in, this office is created in the Constitution to provide impetus to the government to execute the laws of government. Okay, the way this actually works in practice in modern American government, it's not as though Donald Trump spends his days sending out checks, providing benefits, monitoring compliance with laws, or doing the minutia of government. The president does certain things and oftentimes oversees the bureaucracy in a broader sense. But as part of the executive branch, so we'll put the bureaucracy here just to make sure we're clear. The executive branch, the component of the executive branch that's actually doing the day-to-day work of putting laws into place, of implementing them, is the bureaucracy. So we have a bunch of different departments, a bunch of different agencies and commissions. So when you hear this term, that's what we're talking about: departments, agencies, sometimes commissions. We're not going to get into really the distinction between these terms, but more or less they're all part of the bureaucracy. The department is the largest entity in this case. These departments, agencies, and commissions within the executive branch, they are the ones who are actually taking laws passed by Congress and putting them into effect and making sure they're executed according to the intent of the law. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about in terms of the bureaucracy, and that's really what they do. I think before we get into our specific discussion about
all this, the bureaucracy, maybe it makes sense just to elaborate this point a little bit, the overall structure of the executive branch here before we move on, just to make sure everyone is on board with that. So here, this slide that I'm going to bring up, I don't recall showing it to you yet. Could be wrong, but I don't recall showing you this in our discussion of the presidency. But this chart is just showing you the structure of the executive branch, and it's sort of outlining things here as concentric circles around the president, okay, to where the president is in the center, the president oversees the entire executive branch, and then the centers going outward from the president are sort of more distant from the president's day-to-day oversight or day-to-day contact, right? So here we have the outside, the White House staff, is what I meant to say, working very closely with the president. That's people in this box, and as the name is implying, as the term is implying, these are people who are actually working within the White House, many of whom will be in contact with the president on a day-to-day basis. For the most part, the White House staff is working in a political respect. Political meaning they see the president's agenda and they understand it. They take it, and they're the ones trying to work with other branches of government and within the executive branch to make sure that the president's agenda is actually followed. That's more or less the role of the White House staff. I think in our quiz about the presidency, we had this term here up here, the chief of staff, who is the person who's often referred to as the most powerful person in the White House besides the president, the person who oversees the entire White House staff. So this is the closest rung to the president. The next closest rung out would be the executive office of the president. These people work next door. If you've ever heard of the Eisenhower Executive Office building, so there's a building next door close to the White House where these people work. Generally speaking, they're not working in a very, on a day-to-day level with the president. These would be people who are mostly working in a policy advisory manner. So here, the Council of Economic Advisors, their role, as their name is implying, to provide guidance as far as economic policy goes to the president. National Security Council, again, a lot of these terms are descriptive. They're providing national security advice to the president. And you can go through the list. I'm not going to go through it all, but depending on what is going on at a particular point in time, some of these entities may be working very closely for the president. Some of them may be on the back burner. In general, to summarize so far, the White House staff, maybe about 200 people. These overall executive agencies, maybe 2,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. When we get into these departments here, so here, this is the cabinet, listed as the cabinet. The cabinet is just composed of, it meets every once in a while, and it's a group that can give the president, when they meet, an idea of what's going on in each of the different parts of the executive branch and provide broad advice in that respect. The cabinet is primarily composed of the secretaries of these various departments. Okay, so the departments being the broadest entity in the federal bureaucracy. Okay, so here, departments, we're talking about the Department of State, that deals with foreign policy. We'll talk about the Department of Treasury, which deals with fiscal matters. We'll talk about the Department of Justice later on, maybe next week when we get into the judiciary, dealing with law enforcement, Department of Transportation, Agriculture. So for each of these major areas of policy, you have a department secretary overseeing the department and administering all the sub-entities within that department. In this case, when we talk not about the cabinet per se, but these various departments and the various, again, sub-agencies housed within them, we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million federal employees, right? So when we talk about the federal government and its civil service branch, the day-to-day employees who are on the ground doing whatever needs to happen for a given policy, this is where all that action is happening, within these various bureaucratic departments. One here that we've been hearing a lot about, Health and Human Services, just to use as an example if you want an idea of what each of these departments might look like. This is an outline, which the point here isn't that you're going to need to necessarily know all these different agencies within the department, but just to show you the overall structure, right? We have the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who in this case, Alex Azar. If you've been watching some of the president's daily press conferences on the coronavirus, the task force briefings, you've maybe seen this guy there from time to time, Alex Azar. So this is the person overseeing the entire department. There's deputies here, but then within that, you see there are some agencies that you probably recognize maybe generally, and then specifically in the current context of the viral outbreak, right? So the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, whose in this case primary responsibility is testing drugs and making sure they're safe and effective, the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, obviously a pretty important agency in the current context. And so, again, the point here isn't that you need to know all of these different agencies within the specific department. It's just to note you have this department. It's very extensive. Any sort of new law that's passed through Congress that's dealing with healthcare, it's going to be implemented through this department in one of these agencies, or if need be, potentially a new agency. So this is within each of these. Within each of these departments, there's probably thousands and thousands of actual employees working in one of these agencies, doing the day-to-day work of implementing federal law and implementing federal programs. Okay. We'll get more into the functions, the specifics of the functions of a department or agency in a second. I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about these, just in a broad sense, federal departments. So if you're wondering, why do we have this set of departments? Why aren't there other departments? How do we arrive at this particular list? This is something that's determined by Congress, just through the legislative process, right? So if Congress decides that there needs to be a new department, it just has to pass a law saying that we're creating this new department. The most recent department that was actually created here, Homeland Security, down at the bottom. And so this is a department following 9/11 to where Congress investigates the 9/11 attacks, determines there were certain deficiencies in the federal the lead up to the attacks and the federal preparedness in terms of the federal intelligence capacity leading up to the attacks and the response to the attacks. And so they decide we're going to put a whole host of different Homeland Security related functions under a single department where they were previously spread out across different departments. So this was a 2002, Congress passes a law to say in 2002, we're creating this new department, the Department of Homeland Security, and that's how each of these departments come into being, just through a law. Congress can say we're creating a new department. If they want, they could remove a department. So it's just happening through law by this legislative process we've talked about. In general, state, treasury, and defense, these were the, when the nation was, when the Constitution, I should say, was first ratified and the new government goes into effect, these were the only three departments that existed here, state, treasury, and defense. And we'll talk about this more in a second, but throughout the 18th and 19th century, we really have a very small federal bureaucracy. So I think we end up with a total of 6 departments up until the early 1900s. From there on out, we have this explosion of, relative to the prior number, we have a lot of new departments being created by Congress as the role of the federal government expands in the 20th century. But as originally ratified, as the government goes into effect of the ratified Constitution, all we had was the State Department in charge of foreign affairs, the Defense Department, which was called actually the War Department at that point in time, and then the Treasury Department, responsible for federal spending and federal taxation. And then all these others, they come about through subsequent legislation in Congress. So this is just the overall lay of the executive branch. And again, the going inside one particular department within the bureaucracy to see what it looks like. Let's maybe talk now a little bit in more detail about the functions of the bureaucracy. So getting back to that, the role, specifically how they're going about fulfilling this implementation role that they have. So I'll start a new heading here, functions / role of the bureaucracy. And The way I'm going to frame this discussion is maybe just we'll start at the beginning. I mentioned that the overall role here of the bureaucracy is to implement laws passed by Congress. So we could probably start there, in this overall process. So Congress passes a law. We'll stick within a general sense here, then get into some specific examples. Congress passes a new law. Okay, it's not Congress specifically that's going to be putting the law into effect, executing the law. That goes to the executive branch. Specifically, for most laws, there's going to be some relevant department, right? If it's a new law dealing with agriculture, it'll go to the Department of Agriculture to be implemented. If it's a new law dealing with transportation, it'll go to the Transportation Department, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, though, what has to happen is we're going to some department or some specific agency. Okay, so in other words, there's some part of the federal bureaucracy that's identified that needs to actually attend to this law, and that's usually going to be identified within the law itself. Okay, or sometimes you'll see a law create a new agency in order to implement it, but in most cases it'll just be whatever the provisions of the law are. It'll be assigned in the law to some department or agency. What usually happens here at this point, when we get into this, here we're in our bureaucracy here, so I'll separate this out from these prior steps. This would be things happening in Congress. Usually what will happen is the department or agency will need to issue what are known as rules or regulations. And we'll talk about this in more detail. Rules and regulations. So we'll consider these terms synonyms. Rules or regulations, we'll talk about that in a second more. We'll go then, usually there will be some monitoring or enforcement needed. So the rules or regulations, again, we'll talk more in a second, but they're sort of outlining the specifics of how a law is going to be put into place. The monitoring, the enforcement is when the agency or department is actually making sure that these precepts are being followed, the new state of things. And then sometimes administrative justice we'll talk about. To where when we're talking about administrative justice, we mean that within many departments and agencies, they're given a sort of quasi-judicial power to identify entities that are violating their rules and regulations and impose fines on them and administer, as the term is implying, justice within that particular bureaucratic entity. So this is the overall process that the bureaucracy is carrying out in pursuance of a new law. Probably for our purposes, the most important thing for you guys to understand is this regulatory function that the bureaucracy plays. So you hear when people are discussing American politics, the term regulations thrown out a lot. And when you hear that, you want to specifically be thinking about these departments, these agencies, the bureaucracy here. So let's talk about rulemaking in more detail, and then we'll maybe wrap up with these other rules that I talked about here toward the end of our section. Okay, so rulemaking. So the overall purpose of a rule is usually to give specificity to some new provision or some new program passed by Congress. All right, so very often you're going to have a situation in which Congress has something in mind and they give the broad outlines in a law, and usually it would be up to the relevant department or relevant agency to fill in the details. Okay, so I'll give you some examples examples here in a second. The important thing at this moment that I would leave you with, in terms of just the overall idea, is that rules and regulations, they have the force of law. Okay, so when they're issued by a department or agency, when a new rule is published, a new regulation is published, this is basically the same as having a specific law on the books, as if Congress passed the same language. Okay, so this is a very powerful function of the bureaucracy, right? Here we have sort of a quasi-legislative function whereby the bureaucracy has the power to publish rules that have the force of law. Right? So this is something to where we get into a little bit of controversy as far as Sometimes people, questioning whether or not the bureaucracy always uses its power here in a legitimate way, but that's a separate discussion. But okay, so rulemaking rules involve the force of law. The caveat here is that in order to issue a rule, the bureaucracy must have what is known as statutory authority. Statutory authority. So statutes, I've used this term in class before. A statute is just another way of saying law. Okay, a statute is a law passed by Congress. In order for the bureaucracy to actually issue any law, it has to be able to point to issue any new rule, it has to be able to point to a specific law that gives it the statutory authority to do whatever the rule says. Okay, so at this point, I think it's probably useful to get into some examples just to illustrate this, right? And I've got several. Okay, so here, I'll try to use some laws that you guys have maybe heard of and talk about the bureaucratic implementation of those. The Clean Air Act, okay, passed by Congress with the intent here as a descriptive law, in this case, the term designed to reduce air pollution. It's doing that in a number of different ways. One thing that it does is it establishes the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and this is a new bureaucratic entity which is given the authority in this act to regulate emissions into the air. And so it's not as though the Clean Air Act is saying, okay, here are the pollutants that we're going to reduce. Here's the exact amount by which the people and companies are going to be required to reduce them. The authority is given to the EPA through the statute, and then the EPA is passing rules and regulations to give that specificity to things, right? So this is why the EPA exists in large part, to issue rules and regulations to say, here is what we're going to restrict in terms of emissions into the air, and then other legislation talks about pollutants in water and land pollutants, things like this, and rules in terms of exactly by what amount they have to be reduced, what steps polluters have to take in order to reduce those emissions. Oftentimes penalties or fines for violating these rules and regulations. So getting back to our administrative justice role. So these things, these specifics, are powers that are given to the EPA through statute by Congress through the Clean Air Act, right? So here, this is an act by Congress, the Clean Air Act. The EPA, the bureaucratic entity, actually responsible for implementing the law. Another example here. Energy Policy and Conservation Act. This is a 1975 law passed by Congress. The context here is just that there were energy shortages in the mid to late 70s in the United States. And so Congress, in this case, their aim was to reduce energy consumption domestically. And so they passed this act. One provision involves motor vehicles. Okay, so Congress gets in mind that one way that we could reduce consumption of energy is by making our vehicles more fuel efficient. Okay, and so they established through this statute the authority specifically in the Department of Transportation to establish specific fuel standards for new motor vehicles. So the way this happens is the Department of Transportation, they issue a rule establishing what are known as CAFE standards, so corporate average fuel economy, CAFE. And these are rules which are put out initially and then updated from time to time, which say, here's a type of vehicle, this is the minimum fuel economy this vehicle has to have. Okay, here are sedans, here are trucks, here are large trucks, and for each type of vehicle, the Department of Transportation is issuing rules saying, here is what the minimum fuel economy for this type of vehicle has to be. So again, the act passed by Congress is setting the broad parameters, and it's granting the authority to the department. It's not, Congress, again, in and of itself is not the entity that's putting the specifics into place. It's the Department of Transportation through these rules that are establishing the standards. So again, once they're put into place, these rules have the force of law, but the only reason that the Department of Transportation can issue them in the first place is because of the law. Right? So here we have, again, the interplay between congressional delegation of statutory authority and the bureaucracy using that authority to issue rules which have the force of law. A couple more examples. The Endangered Species Act. And I'm just giving you some specific example. I'll know that pretty much every law that's passed by Congress is going to have a similar history to what I'm discussing in these examples here. These are just things that are, I think, easy to understand and illustrative of the overall relationship. The Endangered Species Act, 1973. Again, the terminology is descriptive. This is an act designed to give the federal government the power to protect endangered species, to ensure that their habitats are protected to the extent needed, and to ensure that endangered species don't go that they don't go extinct. Okay, so again, this act is establishing the power for the government to do this sort of thing. It's not, for example, though, giving you a list of species, a list of habitats that are protected, right? So it's not saying, as part of the act, bald eagle, American alligator. I don't have a great list of endangered species available or past endangered species. Monarch butterfly, I think, was one that was eventually put on the list. Okay, so I mean, it's not the laws passed saying, here are these species, we're going to protect them, right? That's not the way it works. The way it works is that the law says, specifically in this case, the Fish and Wildlife Service, they have the authority to go and investigate different species, investigate different habitats, and determine which species are in need of protection and issue rules to say that these are protected species. Okay, rules that say you're not allowed to interfere with these species' habitats, right? So again, the specifics are being filled out in the bureaucracy, in this particular agency, by rules. It's not as though the Fish and Wildlife Service has independent power that it can invent out of thin air to protect a habitat. It has specific statutory authority granted through this act of law, okay, to where it can say, here's an endangered species, here's its habitat, and we're going to restrict development, or we're going to restrict any other activity within the habitat. Okay, so again, Congress passes the law with broad parameters, and they're left up to the bureaucracy to fill out through rules and regulations. And in terms, I'll give you one final example since it's contemporary and I have it handy. The CARES Act. Which is the $2.2 trillion stimulus we just talked about. I guess we talked about a while ago at this point, and that you wrote your QQCs on. So the CARES Act, I've talked about the Department of Treasury at this point, and that's the federal department that's primarily responsible for implementing this act. Okay, so this is, just to go back to our article, if I have it handy, you've got all these different, my screen went away. Give me 1 second. Okay, hopefully that's back. Trying to bring up the article here. Okay, so you have all these different provisions. All right. A bunch of money for individuals, a bunch of money for healthcare, a bunch of loans for small businesses, a bunch of loans to the state governments and industries. And each of these different parts of the law is given to different parts of government, right? So the Treasury, they're the ones that are tasked with administering and distributing these direct payments. Okay, so they have everyone's through the IRS, they have their tax information, and so they have bank account information on people, and so they can make the direct deposits. Treasury is handling that. The Treasury is also handling these loans, okay? $500 billion in loans to states and to corporations. Treasury is handling that. Here, one example that I wanted to point to that I'll show you in terms of the published rule. These loans to small businesses, so this $360 billion pot of money, which is, the actual name is the Paycheck Protection Program. That's the law. That's a program established through this law to lend money to these small businesses so that they can keep employees on payroll rather than having to fire them. That's being implemented through the Small Business Administration. Okay, so this particular part of the CARES Act, I keep wanting to say patient, the Paycheck Protection Program. Small Business Administration is responsible for that. And in terms of how that gets put into effect, the law is passed. It has these broad parameters saying we're establishing this program where small businesses can borrow money from the SBA and use that to pay off their employees. And we're going to eventually forgive those loans. So those are the broad precepts of the law. What the SBA then has to do is produce something like this. And you'll note, this isn't a document, again, that you need to get intimately familiar with, but these are the rules administered by the SBA to actually put the specifics of the Paycheck Protection Program into place. Okay, so here, the way the program is being run is that the banks are responsible, those who are participating, for loaning money to these businesses. The federal government is providing a guarantee of those loans, and then eventually the federal government is going to forgive those loans under certain circumstances. So this document, you see this is 31 pages, which I won't go through in entirety. This is a document issued by the SBA to give you these rules on how this program is going to be run. Okay, so it says, it talks about what the banks will be doing, what the exact dollar amounts of the loans. It talks about the conditions for forgiving the loans. It talks about all the different details that you would need as a bank to participate in this program. Okay, so this is just an example here, taking what Congress passes as its a broad program that it wants to put into place and giving you specifics, the bureaucracy in this case, the agency giving you specifics about how the program will be implemented through its rules. Okay, and this is something, if you wanted to look it up, you could, and you have trouble finding it, let me know. But again, you don't need to really get familiar with the specifics of what a rule would look like, but this is just giving you an example of how this is happening in real time as we're going along. So this is something, actually, if you've been following the news in detail, there's been questions as far as the rollout of this program. Were these rules issued in a timely fashion, and are they entirely clear? So there's questions about the implementation of this program and whether it's going effectively or not. So again, a very contemporary example in this case. Okay, so these are all examples of rules that would be issued. I talked also, just to round out the discussion about the role of the bureaucracy, I talked about most agencies having some sort of monitoring or enforcement role. We're monitoring, we could maybe separate these out into different monitoring and enforcement, but monitoring just implies you've got these rules issued. Usually it's within the agency where there's some entity making sure that they're complied with. Okay, so for instance, the EPA, if they have suspicion that some polluter is not complying with a new regulation about reducing an emission or putting certain protections into place, the EPA usually will have a role of going around and auditing companies to make sure they're in compliance. The enforcement role also comes back to this administrative justice concept we talked about briefly, I guess, at this point. Administrative justice, this is just the idea that when, I mentioned that these rules have the force of law, okay? And it's not as though a department or agency has the ability to impose criminal penalties, right? So they can't arrest you, they can't throw you into jail. They have the ability to fine you, though. So that's something that can be done in-house. It's something that this is, if we were to get into the full discussion, there's some controversy surrounding this concept of administrative justice and whether or not this quasi, in this case, judicial function is a legitimate role of the bureaucracy, whether the bureaucratic entity should have the power to impose penalties, in this case, financial for the most part, on people. But in most agencies, they will have some ability to do this. If in their monitoring they see that somebody is not in compliance or some company is not in compliance, they can usually assess penalties against that person or entity through their administrative justice role. And if need be, sometimes if there's If there's corresponding criminal penalties, that would be done through the judiciary, right? So they're actually the need to criminally prosecute someone. That's not happening within the bureaucracy. That's going over to our judicial branch. But if it's just something to where a bureaucratic agency finds out that somebody that it's regulating or some entity that's regulating is not in compliance, through its own in-house administrative justice role, it will usually have the power to assess fines. So that's what we mean here. Again, there's a lot more discussion that could be had here beyond the current context, but I think I'll leave it at that. In this case, what I wanted to wrap up with was just a couple of different points. One here, I guess, before maybe I'll flip the order of what I was intending here just for a second. One of these points I wanted to make was sort of an aside. Okay, so we've talked about these various departments, Department of Transportation, Department of Treasury. These departments, they all are overseen by department secretaries. I mentioned that. These members of the president's cabinet, and the president is the person with the advice and consent of the Senate, as we talked about, who is appointing these various heads of the department. So in some sense, it's not always the case, but in some sense, these departments and the bureaucracy in general is politicized. Okay, so this is just the way things work. The president gets to determine who is filling the important seats in the bureaucracy, and so usually what you will see is these various departments will be led by people who reflect the president's agenda. Okay, so that's just the way things work, based on the fact that the president gets to appoint these various positions: the Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of whatever. That's a person appointed by the president. Okay? Usually, when a new president comes in, the old secretaries will go out, and the president will put new people in place. Okay, so in some sense, the bureaucracy is politicized. That being said, there are certain areas of certain areas of policy that we do not want to be politicized, right? To where when we need regulation, we don't want it to be put in place. We don't want rules, we don't want regulations issued in a politicized manner. We want some degree of independence. And in these areas of policy, oftentimes the Congress will form what is known as an independent regulatory commission. Okay, and I'll give you an example here in a second, but the short of this is just that an independent regulatory commission is designed to have a greater degree of insulation from the president than a department or an agency. Okay, so here it's not as though it's completely free from the president's influence, which we'll talk about in a second, but the point is that the president is, generally speaking, not going to be able to just dismiss the entire commission and replace it with whoever the president wants. Right? There's by law going to be established parameters that define who and how, who's filling the seats on the commission and how they're filled. Okay, so for instance, one area we'd probably not want to be subject to partisan influence. One regulatory area we don't want to be subject to partisan influence would be elections. Okay, we want elections in the country. In this case, we're speaking specifically to federal elections rather than state elections. But in terms of federal elections, we don't want them to be politicized. We want them to be fair. We want election regulations to be free of partisan infighting. So we want to put a commission into place that's independent in nature. So if you've heard of the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, this is one example of an independent regulatory commission, and these are again passed through law by Congress, usually signed by the president. And the FEC, its job is primarily, it does a few other things, but its job is primarily to monitor the financial side of elections, to make sure that all the candidates and all the donors are in compliance with federal campaign finance laws. So it issues regulations each election cycle to say how much can you donate to a candidate. It monitors, it takes in from each candidate for office financial disclosures as far as where the money is coming from and how much a candidate is receiving. So this is the entity that's tasked with monitoring federal elections and regulating them. Obviously, it's not something that we want the Republican candidate, or excuse me, the Republican president or the Democratic president to come in and use to his or her advantage. And so the way this works is there are 6 commissioners on the FEC, on the commission here. They are appointed by the president with advice and consent of the Senate, but by law, only three out of the 6 seats on the commission are able to be filled by one party. Okay, so the Republicans can only have 3 commissioners appointed by, as Republicans. The Democrats can only have 3 commissioners as well. So what we really see in practice is that it's an even partisan split on the commission as far as who's filling these roles. The point here is just that it requires a majority. It requires 4 out of the 6 to actually take any action to issue a new rule to change existing rules in the FEC. So by definition, you have to have some degree of bipartisan concurrence to have any change administered through the FEC. Okay, so, again, 3 out of 6 from one party, 4 out of 6 needed to actually pass a new rule or regulation. Another example of a federal election commission, an independent regulatory commission, is the FCC, not the FEC, but the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to where, again, we don't really want, this is if you're not familiar, this is a commission dealing with licensing of broadcasting entities, which is, again, not something we'll get into the details of, but again, something that Congress has determined they don't want it to be subject to partisan influence. The communications, mass communication, it involves the dissemination of information to the public, and so it's not something that we really want one party to have control of the regulation. And so again, it's an independent regulatory commission, the FCC. That would be another example here. That was sort of the aside here. These independent regulatory commissions, just special cases of bureaucratic entities. They're doing, by and large, the same thing as a regular agency. It's just that the way that they're composed differs. Usually it's statutorily defined and in a nonpartisan manner, the way that these commissions are filled. The final topic here in our discussion then, that being said, would just be, I wanted to mention here how the bureaucracy has evolved over time. And two specific types of changes I'll highlight here. First of all, changes in terms of the size or scope of the bureaucracy. And then second of all, changes in terms of how the bureaucracy is composed. So who is filling jobs within the federal agencies or the federal departments here. So here we'll talk about the different systems, roughly speaking, that we've had over the course of our nation's history. First of all, the spoils system or the patronage system, which we'll talk about, again, synonymously with one another. These are basically synonyms for the same thing. I think the book uses patronage, but spoils system, at least in my view, is maybe a more common term here. The spoils system or the patronage system, both referring to the same thing. Eventually transitioning into what we have now, the civil service system. And I'll just take these discussions here in order. So first of all, size and scope of the bureaucracy. The discussion here, I think it's first worth referring to just the overall historical change we've talked about in the power and role of the federal government. We've had this discussion I think, at least a few times in the class, to where up until about the early part of the 20th century, specifically the Great Depression ends up being a major catalyst here, the federal government was relatively disconnected from everyday life for most people. The federal government wasn't taking a huge interest or huge role in the economy or other aspects of society. We get into the early 1930s, though, specifically the Roosevelt administration and the New Deal suite of policies are associated with an expansion in the powers of federal government and the role of the federal government in society. And so it's roughly speaking around the 20th century where we also see an increase in the overall size and scope of the federal bureaucracy. So it's getting larger and it's doing more things. And I've got a few charts here to illustrate this. Here's one showing you the overall number of people working in the federal bureaucracy. So the number of people employed by the federal government, the total number in thousands here. And so This doesn't go all the way out to 2016, but it's roughly in this area. You see in the current era, we have, I mentioned this before, roughly 2 million people. It's actually more than that right now. A rather large number of people working in the federal government. And when we talk about this, here we're talking about the orange line, by the way, rather than the dashed one in this case. But the orange line, the total number of civilian employees in the federal government, and that number has grown pretty substantially. Right? You see here, up until the beginning of the 20th century, this line is basically zero. Okay, right? So there's there are very few people working for the federal government. Eventually, we get into the 20th century, and specifically, the rate of increase really begins to ramp up in the 30s, and in the Great Depression, the New Deal era. The federal government is doing more things. There are more laws and more programs need to be implemented, and so as an extension, more people need to be filling positions in the bureaucracy. And so you see this growth in the 20th century upward to our current point, to where really there are upwards of 2 million people in the federal bureaucracy. And so maybe some of you will eventually go and work in federal government. You would be contributing to this line. The dash line here, this one, the total, which I've ignored to this point, this is including defense employees, right? So you see this big line here, that's World War II. And so this isn't, I don't think, as descriptive as just the overall civilian employment, but it's interesting to look at. So the same trends overall, if we include the defense employees. Obviously, there's a big spike during World War II, but still it parallels the orange line for the most part in its growth. But anyway, that's one way in which the size of the federal bureaucracy has increased through the number of people working and filling these positions. One other way that we might approach, and one other indicator is maybe a better way to put it, of the increasing scope of the federal bureaucracy is just the number of rules that are issued. We talked about the rulemaking power being the primary means by which bureaucratic entities institute new policies or change existing policies that are passed with statutory authority through Congress. And so one thing we'll see here is just that as time goes on, as more and more programs, as more and more rules are adopted by the federal government, the number of rules issued increases as well. And so this is another 20th century phenomenon. What this graph is showing you here, you see the y-axis is number of pages published in the Federal Register. Okay, so this is a term we haven't talked about yet, the Federal Register. It's something that I think you should note. The Federal Register is the official publication issued by the United States government every day in which any new regulation or rule is published. Okay? There are also executive orders or executive memoranda, things like this go into the Federal Register as well. But by and large, the Federal Register is the publication including bureaucratic issuance of rules and regulations. So if I were to go back to show you the Paycheck Protection Program rules, those would, they're going to be published in the Federal Register at some point if they haven't already been. So the number of pages here is a rough indicator, what's going on the y-axis. It's a rough indicator of just the frequency or the number of new rules that are being issued. And so here we're a little bit later into the 20th century, but you see specifically in the 70s, there's a big spike, right? And we go upward. We're going from a situation in which relatively few rules are issued and to one in which there's some fluctuation, right? So there's, here we get into the early 80s, this is the Reagan administration, so there's some deregulation going on there. But overall, the number of new pages here, the number of, or I guess this is the overall size, excuse me, it stayed roughly the same. There hasn't been a major decrease, right? So we've had this major increase in the middle to late 20th century, and that's sort of where we still are. And it does vary from president to president. Some presidents are, they're more prone to be expansionary in the number of rules and regulations issued. Some presidents make it a point of deregulating things, right? Again, we're getting into the political discussion here of the proper role of the federal bureaucracy. I think if you look at the Trump administration, they would be, similar in this situation to where you've got some downward movement. This obviously doesn't go out to 2016, but the Trump administration makes it a point, or they have made it a point to try to institute deregulation, prior administration, a Democratic administration, usually you don't see that emphasized as much, right? Democrats are, getting to the political discussion, Democrats usually not uncomfortable with a strong regulatory environment. Republicans oftentimes express wariness of, should we have this many regulations on the books? So in both of these indicators, the number of regulations in this chart, or in this case, again, we looked at the number of employees by either measure, and we can look at other measures as well. By either measure, the federal bureaucracy has grown very dramatically in the 20th century, or it did, I should say, past tense, grow very dramatically in the 20th century, in alignment with the overall expansion of the role and the scope of the federal government. It makes sense. As the federal government is taking on more roles, you need more in place to actually implement the rules, implement the laws, issue rules associated with those laws. Final point here, I guess, beyond just the size and scope of government, the government bureaucracy, the way that bureaucratic roles are filled, in this case, by roles, I mean jobs, specific positions in the bureaucracy, the way that they have been filled has changed pretty dramatically over time as well. This is a transition that happens early on in the 20th century as part of this era of progressive reforms, which I mentioned a few times. Progressive in this case, having a little bit of a different meaning than what our contemporary usage of the term would imply. The progressive era, we talked about, I think, things like the secret ballot coming along in terms of the progressive reforms, transparency in government. So if you recall to our PBS documentary on Congress, they talked about how you had the situation in the Senate and the House to where there are often pretty direct payoffs for industry. In the progressive era, one of the aims is to reduce that and bring the actual motives of government more into line with the people. That one of the aims. And so one thing that happens in terms of the progressive era is this transition in the bureaucracy from what's known as a spoils system to what is known as the civil service system, which we have still today. The spoils system is associated, at least in terms of its beginning, with the Jackson administration, so going back to the 19th century. And back then, you recall back to the graph I just showed you, during the entire 19th century, the 1800s, there were very few, first of all, there were very few positions in the federal bureaucracy. The government wasn't doing that much, and so it didn't need that many bureaucratic positions. But what positions were there? These tended to be pretty well-paying positions. They tended to have some degree of stature associated with them. And so they were desirable positions, and usually what would happen is instead of figuring out who is the best person for the job, who has the best qualifications, they would usually just be doled out to people who were politically allied with the current president. All right, so you would have it's not a recipe for great efficiency or a well-functioning bureaucracy, right? If you've got someone in the job just because they happen to be loyal to the president, and this is not just Jackson, but going forward, up until this progressive reform era, you would have people getting into their jobs really when they didn't deserve them. You'd have frequent turnover. So whenever there was a new presidential administration, if there was a party switchover, there would be everyone getting replaced in the federal bureaucracy. And so there are a number of different reasons, both ethically and practically, why this is not really a great system. Specifically when we get into this transition in the early 20th century where the federal government wants to take on more of a role, it becomes necessary to sort of institute new standards of hiring and filling these roles in the bureaucracy. And so we eventually transitioned to what is known as the civil service system. And the fundamental principles here, I guess, are just merit and qualification, right? You hire people into the civil service, into positions within the bureaucracy based on their qualifications, based on that person being the best for the job. Okay, and so here what we see in our modern civil service is that you don't see a person working in, most people at least, an average bureaucrat in the Department of Transportation or the Small Business Administration or transportation. These people will generally stay in their positions as a career because they're gaining expertise. they're well-qualified people. You don't have dramatic turnover throughout the entire bureaucracy like you would when it's a politically motivated system, right? You'll still see the very tops of these departments and agencies. So the secretaries, the other high-level positions will be filled by those loyal to the president. But the average bureaucrats who, at least in theory, they're getting their job based on qualification, based on expertise, they're staying around and keeping their job and working in a non-political manner, right? So if any of you, once you graduate, get into applying for jobs in the federal government, the hiring, again, at least in theory, is based on who's qualified, and you have separate systems for political jobs, which are relatively few, versus civil service jobs, which are where most of these 2 million plus people are working in the civil service. Okay, so that's about all I had to say as far as the bureaucracy goes. I think that about covers what I wanted to go through in the lecture. Again, I guess as a reminder, I would just say, get in touch with me by whatever means you need to. Email, Zoom office hours. If you either want to talk about the course material, the course in general, or any difficulties you're having, please let me know. I'm trying to be as accommodating as possible, but that requires me and you to be in correspondence if you're somebody who has concerns. Beyond that, just as a reminder, we'll have the quiz on Friday on the bureaucracy, which, again, it should be pretty similar to other quizzes we've had in the class. It's just going to be online. And finally, please remember the judiciary chapter. Read that whenever you get a chance. That will be the topic for next week's video lecture. It will be something that we probably will have a quiz on next week, which I will, of course, give you more details on. Otherwise, thanks, everyone. As usual, please remain safe. Please stay sensible during the times. It's, we're getting to a point where maybe there are some glimmers of hope that we'll get through this and go back to some degree of normalcy, not in this semester, but perhaps in later semesters. So anyway, I'm signing off now. I'll talk to you guys next time. See you later.